And hello again, boys and girls. Welcome back to the channel. It's of course your host Marley Startled, and it's another after action report for another nation. This was done with the new patch, and I do think there are some minor bugs that have come out from the new patch, or perhaps it's just bad luck in my game, because I've had a few nations in constant states of evolution. I believe Austria has revolted about 3 times throughout my playthrough, France about twice, and Prussia about twice, and Britain about 4 times. But regardless, the new patch has hopefully made things more interesting, and I suspect eventually Paradox will fix it. But this time we were playing the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire is a very interesting, very challenging nation. So, as we talked about previously, we've talked about Great Britain, the USA. Yeah, we'll go onto that about a bit later. And of course, we've talked about the two Sicilies, and each have had its own unique problems. Great Britain has had a problem trying to expand its markets and trying to maintain its growth through expanding its markets. We've had the USA that's sort of had its limitations in terms of its political system, but has had its benefits by having a massive industry. We've had Sicily that's had its limitations with natural resources, but its benefits by being a very healthy political system, a very proactive and liberal government with the ability to reform. And then, of course, we have Turkey. So every sort of, or the Ottoman Empire. So every sort of nation had its negatives, but also had its benefits. So Great Britain's access to mass resources, the negative being, of course, its necessity to grow and expand its markets. The USA with its massive industry, but potential for civil war and lack of population. And Sicily with, of course, its political situation and its lack of domestic resources. Now, the Ottoman Empire is interesting because it combines all the problems of each nation or each economic system into one package. Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, is effectively limited by a political system where its political class is radical and unwilling to liberalize. It has also got a poor resource industry at the start and a poor industry. It's also got very strong political opponents alongside the north and west of its nation, cultures that are simply at odds with the Ottoman Turks at the start of the game and its legal systems, and a military that is downright awful. The Ottoman Empire is truly the sick man of Europe at the game start, and it's really up to you as a player to sort of salvage it. So when I initially played the Ottoman Empire, the aim was, of course, to keep the monarchy. Obviously, that failed. Then the second was to become a recognized power, and then the third was to establish a sort of consumer goods empire to remain relevant. Initially, Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, I'm going to keep on saying Turkey, I do apologize. The Ottoman Empire starts out with a very strong opponent, Italy, that has a lot of its core territories, an army that is effectively redundant, a political system that is full of powerful stakeholders, such as the local governors, and an industry that is pretty much not there. And so the main effort was to, of course, in order to it was to industrialize and, of course, liberalize in order to stay and maintain and grow as a nation without becoming dependent on one of the major powers. So initially, I set out with the plan to sort of initially build barracks to go to war with Egypt. Of course, I thought it was going to be a war by event, but actually, no, you have to declare it yourself. And I began war with Egypt, and a lot of my playthrough was just being lucky with how bad the AI acted on the fronts. So initially, I set up my troops, called out the conscripts, and moved in, and immediately got blapped by the Egyptians. Luckily, they left Tripolitania, that front, completely isolated. So though I was losing in the north, about 5 battalions marched in and secured Cairo, which allowed me to regain my first set of territory. Then, of course, it set about with a second war, at which stage the British were clapping the Egyptians independently to take Crete and a treaty port, which eventually called in the Russians, which again led to a mess of fronts, which again allowed me to get a war score, even though the Russians and the Egyptians had marched pretty much halfway through Turkey. Because again they left the fronts undefended, I was able to march through and secure Cairo and win and push them forward and out of the Sinai region. This concluded with a final battle which turned them into a puppet. But doing all of this, you've got to start with a really sort of but poor economy. Yeah, Turkey really, or the Ottoman Empire, really has no sort of arms industry to speak of, nor has it got any sort of heavy coal. Equally, its population has extremely low qualifications, aren't particularly literate, and a lot of the laws that are in place are simply not there. And economically speaking, a lot of its taxation is very bad. So initially, its taxation is on land-based taxation, which over the course of the game is simply not profitable. And so while I was doing this, I sort of began to build up my industry, and I looked around to see what could I meet, what was not particularly demanding, and I could mass produce to fill a market void. And I found that silk was extremely good in that affair. With the ability to build silk, I was able to build a clothing industry, which then allowed me to bring revenue in. This then, of course, allowed me to try and do my circular sort of economy of being sort of self-contained, which was, of course, going through my deficits and going, okay, build a bit of this, build a bit of that. Okay, I've got a deficit there, build a bit of this. And this sort of circular industrialization, which, of course, had its own problems being that initially Turkey had, or the Ottoman Empire, I'm going to keep saying Turkey, the Ottoman Empire has very little in terms of infrastructure and in terms of qualifications. And often the pace of demand outpaced my ability to meet that demand. And so early on, I was very dependent on foreign power imports. This also meant that because they saw me as a minor relevant power, a lot of my trade, or a lot of resources I was producing, was being snatched up by the foreign powers, being Austria, Britain, France, and of course Russia, who kept on taking all my tools. At some stages, I believe they were taking about half of the tools I was making. I believe they're still taking a healthy dose, 3.9k, and this was a very big problem. So trying to develop economically was also extremely difficult as the Ottoman Empire. But the biggest thing the Ottoman Empire has to struggle with is its political classes. So within the political system of the Ottoman Empire, there's a lot of radical stakeholders. You have the state governors initially, who I believe are no longer with us because of the revolt, who are pro-slavery and are about 60% of the political clout. Any attempt to reform would, of course, inspire revolution and civil war. At the same time, because I've got the quote-unquote liberal class of the Ottoman Empire, the intelligentsia, and of course some of the industrialists, although they hate slavery and will revolt over it given time, they hate slavery but are neutral to abolishing it. So they effectively are complaining about slavery but do not want to see it abolished, meaning that often when you attempt to reform, you'd end up upsetting the main stakeholder, that was the state governors, to the point they would revolt or threaten revolution, but you wouldn't keep the other political parties happy. And as with other nations that generally there'd be consensus among political parties you could exploit, with the Ottoman Turks, all the political parties are very much against each other. And if you passed one bit of legislation to sort of fix your country, it'd end up radically upsetting the other classes significantly. So initially I tried to play it safe. I thought, okay, I will go with something that is not going to accept too many people, the professional army. Then of course I wanted to educate my people, and so I tried to go for public schools. However, the quote-unquote liberal political class, that is of course the intelligentsia, the petite bourgeoisie, and of course the industrialists, then threatened revolution. And the reason why the liberal class were revolting was because of migrant controls. They wanted to go away from free trade and go away to no restrictions to migrant controls. That's right, your liberal class are not particularly liberal as the Ottoman Empire, and although they are quote unquote, I would treat them as slightly less conservative than the state governors. So a lot of the time when you're trying to pass legislation to sort of liberalize your nation, most of those policies are not appeasing most of your political parties, and in fact are upsetting the ones that count. So this eventually led to the first revolution, which I was able to win as the Ottoman Empire, again exploiting the AI front lines, leaving them undefended, and that bought me time to push through some more reforms. But if I could demonstrate, for example, if I was to, let's cancel this, and go with, say, women in the workplace, you can see here I'd appease two parties, then massively piss off three other parties. At the same time, if I tried to do something more conservative, or such as protectionism, I'd keep one party happy, then piss off two other parties. And that is a big problem with the Ottoman Empire. Your political parties are generally so are odds with each other that they will often begin revolting and just cause massive problems. So trying to remain as a monarchy or trying to remain with the current status quo while industrializing and liberalizing is almost impossible without the threat of civil war, which then of course brings in the other foreign powers that are able to sort of get chunks out of you because of it. So after the first civil war, I was able to buy some time, but because of the political limitations of the Ottoman Empire, it meant that I couldn't abolish slavery till about 1905 because the state governors were simply too strong. I think this is a nation that really promotes the use of authority in stamping down and repressing certain parties. However, the optimum route to liberalization is probably through revolution as the Ottoman Empire, simply because if you attempt to try and piece of peacefully liberalize, it will be such a slow and drawn out process that you're simply not going to achieve it in any time soon, and the odds are you're still going to have end up with revolution. Not only this, but the Ottoman Turks are almost on a almost on a schedule to secession and civil war, with a large amount of cultures that are simply opposed to your form of government. So if you don't liberalize, then you also run the risk of the Balkans tearing away and effectively becoming independent or forcing diplomatic plays that could see you lose territory. So the Ottoman Empire is an extremely difficult nation, which is both economically weak, politically fragmented, and militarily backwards. And this, of course, led to a lot of problems. So my first step was, of course, to begin liberal sort of reform, while also building the industry in the hopes that this would force a larger political class that was more liberal. This simply did not occur for a large part of the game. And as I noted earlier, as you probably know, my circular type of development, build a bit of this, build a bit of that, oh, I need to build some of that, rather than relying on trade, simply didn't work as the Turks because of the lack of qualifications and also the fact that industrially, what would happen is you'd end up with a equal share of stakeholders. Now, with other nations such as Great Britain or the USA, an equal share of stakeholders isn't that bad because, for the most part, they've all got fairly inline political views with the odd one or two radical views, which, of course, if you build your nation circularly, so you have a bit of a rural industry, a bit of industrial industry, a bit of a bureaucrat industry, isn't that bad when you're playing another nation. But playing as the Ottoman Empire, having that sort of wide breadth of demographics is awful because this wide breadth of demographics all have radical views that are at odds with each other. And so by building wide and having this wide political cloud of intelligentsia, bureaucrats, petite bourgeoisie, and industrialists, you are just setting yourself up for a civil war. This means it can be very difficult to play as the Ottomans because, on the one hand, you want to remain independent and grow to become an independent recognized power, but in doing so and building a self-sustaining industry, you effectively lead to political discord and civil war or revolution. So one of the options I could have gone with is simply given up the ability to become a recognized power and focused on one particular industry, such as the rural industry, and then of course had a large rural class, and then became dependent on other resources from foreign powers. But as my aim was to become a recognized independent power, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be self-contained. Whereas, of course, the easier option as Turkey is perhaps just to resign yourself to a secondary dependent power. And in that way, you can change the demographics as you see fit. So you have a particularly large rural or particularly large industrial demographic that then is less likely to cause political issues. But building circularly, like I do in a lot of my games, actually leads to a lot of political turmoil. This, coupled with the bad economy, which is often a product of your lack of industry and lack of qualifications early on, means that often you've got high taxation, which of course breeds higher turmoil. And so my strategy of normally is going lots and lots of consumption taxes simply did not work as the Ottoman Empire because I needed that to repress certain political parties. Regardless, a lot of the time you feel when you're playing Ottoman Empire is that every step is a gamble. Every step could potentially resign you to the dustbin of history. You truly are the sick man of Europe, and you're just hoping no one intervenes. And so, of course, when I was playing with Egypt, as soon as I saw Russia join or fighting Egypt, as soon as I saw Russia joined, that was the potential for my empire to collapse or my nation to collapse. Or when I tried to do some colonization, that was also a risk of the empire collapsing. When I tried to get recognized by attacking France when it was having its own revolution, Austria joined, and that was another chance of potential collapse. Even now, with the income I have, I'm still pretty much a paper tiger with my research fairly backwards, and of course only one war away from real financial and political collapse. And so as playing as the Ottoman Empire, you truly understand the weight and the constraints of the economic system and the political system is upon you, and one bad step or just one bad war could result in complete collapse of your nation. Regardless, I had to think, if I was just trying to do my three targets to become a recognized power, become self-sustaining and maintain the monarchy, I had to think about how I could achieve this. And so my main steps were to, of course, expand into Africa where I could in order to get some resources from there, such as dye, so I could remain independent. Expand and puppet Egypt. So, of course, I would be able to get its resources and I would have a strong secondary power as my ally. And then I intended to make a customs union. And so, as you can see here, it's got worse because of my revolution that turned me into Turkey. But my aim was to sort of turn the Middle East into a customs union with Afghanistan, the Kievan markets, and so on, as well as Spain, Morocco. And for a stage, this did work rather well until I had my revolution, my second revolution, that inevitably led to a lot of the nations leaving the market. At the stage of this game, about 1926, I was able to sort of extend my market again, but it was still a long way to go from the halcyon days of the entire Mediterranean, bar Italy, bar France, and bar the Ottoman, and bar Austria, as well as all these minor nations being part of the group. So, as I said, initially I started building silk to focus on the clothing market and then used that revenue to industrialize via coal, iron, and tools. Of course, a lot of that was taken out of my market, and for a large part of the game, I was going through mini recessions throughout because of that lack of supply and demand. This in turn meant that I had to sort of deal with high taxation throughout the game, which initially wasn't too bad early on, but as the game progressed, got worse. But after expanding, I was able to add some nations such as Ethiopia into my market and able to expand my colonies to get hold of some dye. From there, I attempted to build up my military, and I had to be very clever with my spending. If I wasn't going through war, I would purposely downgrade my armies because, again, Turkey has no arms industry to speak of and can't afford a particularly large one early on in the game. And then, of course, when a war began, I immediately switched these up to a higher level and just about got away with it each time. I had to effectively scrap my navy because I couldn't afford to do so. And in terms of actual market access, again, I built a lot of railways that couldn't be staffed because of a lack of qualifications. But eventually you are able to limp through as the Ottomans building that circular industry, but it's not the most optimum or safe way of doing it. I think the thing I really liked about the Ottoman Turks was really the political system. It's the first time I've really had to get to grips with the political system, because normally, as I've mentioned, a lot of the political groups are pretty passive or have agreeing points. But these political groups in Ottoman Turks are completely at odds. They are completely against one another. You try and reform a little bit, half the parties will revolt. If you try and not reform at all, then of course the other political parties that want reform will revolt. And so you are a nation really out being fought over in terms of reform. And that was a really interesting affair. Of course, once I did build up my industry into the silk industry and so on, I then began, of course, building into other things such as coal, which, of course, Turkey has a lot of, iron, steel, and so on and so forth. But, of course, that's not really the big thing about the Ottoman Turks. The big thing is the turmoil and the lack of multiculturalism and the general laws that are simply at odds with your multicultural empire. And so a lot of the time was spent first, of course, trying to get an education system, which of course led to civil war because of the Liberal Party not wanting no migration controls. And then, of course, it was then I spent about 30 years or so attempting to get proportional taxation, which again upset most of my country, but I needed it in order to actually make money. Because again, you start off with a lot of bad economic systems. You've still got slavery enabled, which is great for rural industries, but not great for a nation that wants to become self-sustaining. You've got women's suffrage, which again, a lot of the parties like, but if you attempt to go through No, that's wrong. You've got legal guardianship, which a lot of little parties like, but if you attempt to develop or grow, as you can see here, you're just going to have a civil war. I went through a stage, there was a halcyon days period where all my parties did tie up, like come together for 1 week, where I was able to get through women's suffrage. And then, like a week later, they threatened revolution unless I went back to propertied women. And so, like, it's a nation that is at constant at war with itself to actually push through any sort of reforms. Of course, I did push for colonial exploitation early, so I could expand the colonies, and then eventually I was able to push through total separation after the next civil war, which came in 1905. So about 1900, I was able to actually abolish slavery because the state governors became a small enough force in my nation. But then I think the revolt was over universal suffrage, which of course I was not willing to do, and it was a product of my wide economic system leading to a wide demographic. I think the big mistake you make the big mistake I made as the Ottoman Turks or the Ottoman Empire was trying to make a wide economic system, because the wide economic system led to wide economic parties with very different views to one another, which unfortunately would lead to civil war. But regardless, once I did begin to expand my industry and I was able to build some self-sustainable sort of logging camps and so on, I was able to build up a lot of textile mills and build up, of course, a lot of furniture. Well, a few furniture factories, but most of it came into tools because the other powers kept on taking all my tools by export. After I'd established Egypt and Turkey and the sort of Turkish Africa, my main effort then was to expand the customs market, because I wanted access to Persia and I wanted access to Afghanistan's opium. This worked out fairly well early on, but unfortunately, as soon as civil wars kicked off, it meant that for the most part, I would lose access to those markets, leading to economic decline. At the same time, because of my poor research, because of my poor literacy, because again I couldn't pass through educations because everyone would kick off if I did. I couldn't get my education very high enough to do rapid research. So I did try and go through a phase of liberating the sort of Arab Peninsula from the British, and it almost ended up with me losing chunks of my territory because my troops simply weren't good enough, and it ended up with Jebel Shammar actually becoming a puppet of the British. So even though I am number one as a great power, I'm really a paper tiger. I mean, economically I'm wealthy, but in terms of military and government, I'm extremely backwards and unable to really reform. It's a nation where you are fighting with your own nation to reform, and you need to reform to become independent. And so that's why I think if you were to really optimize the Ottomans, you'd probably want to revolt as soon as possible, so you end up with a more liberal party or a more liberal political system. But trying to actually survive as the Ottoman Turks without becoming more liberal or without reforming a government or without revolution is a nightmare, because you've got some very conservative political stakeholders, and of course, even your liberal stakeholders are still fairly conservative. Still, I was able to expand into Turkey, Turkish Africa, taking Chad and so on, and then of course I was able to expand my markets. After that, I wanted to become recognized, and in order to become recognized, I wanted to pick on the weakest target. Now, maybe it's this patch, maybe it's this game, but pretty much every major nation or every nation on the map has had a civil war. France has had a civil war, first with a military governor called Duc d'Arlon, I forgot his first name, and of course it was during that war that I saw my opportunity to become recognized. Instead of picking on a weaker one that was Italy on paper, I decided to pick on France because it was holding on to Marseille and was effectively dying in a civil war. That almost got me killed, because almost as soon as I declared war, about 200 French battalions turned up and started clapping me in Africa. But luckily for me, once again, the French capitulated to the revolutionaries, and that meant all their battalions disappeared for a while, and I was able to expand and then get recognized. So once again, it's a nation of really looking for opportunities to attack the weaker units, weaker nations, and even then struggling to do so. A lot of this game was luck, really. Of course, by that stage, I'd become recognized and I built this sort of circular industrial economy of steel and so on and so forth, and things started to get better. However, the political system did not, and I did begin to start having secessions in Montenegro, Serbia, and Bulgaria, which I was able to control because Austria was having its own civil wars as well. And in consequence, I had to perform multiculturalism. Of course, by forming multiculturalism, this in turn led to more turmoil. And then, of course, I had to do state conscience, which then led to even more turmoil, total separation, which led to even more turmoil. And it seemed that no matter what I did, I always ended up in turmoil. And this eventually led to my second revolution, which of course was over universal suffrage. And initially I didn't think much of it because, hey, I'd beaten the first revolution very easily by exploiting the front lines. This wouldn't be too bad. I was wrong, and most of Turkey flipped over, well, most of the Ottomans flipped over to the revolutionary Turks. This, of course, meant that I had a few units in the north and a few units in the south, and although Persia and Afghanistan and so on did try and join, and the East India Trading Company tried to join to help, this did not work, and eventually I lost the game and decided to carry on as Turkey. Rather amusingly, the first revolution ended up with me with a 3-year-old caliph, or a 3-year-old Ottoman emperor that governed the Ottoman Empire up until really the second revolution. The second revolution, led by the trade unionists and the intelligentsia, then of course pushed through more and more reforms. And initially, reforms were things such as universal suffrage, protected speech, and old age pensions, and effectively more liberal systems. Unfortunately, even now, I'm still a victim of the political system, and every once in a while, a major power broker such as the petite bourgeoisie or the rural folk will threaten revolution unless I apply wealth voting, or unless I add migrant controls. And because I don't want another revolution, I simply do what they tell me and hope they leave me alone. A lot of the times they do, and so I'm being quite lucky. I'll pretend to pass the law until they go away, and then I'll cancel the law. I think a lot of it comes from turmoil, because as the Ottoman Turks, you're always going to have tide turmoil from your multicultural society, your slavery, and your religious laws, and your cultural laws, which means you're always going to have high radicals. And plus, when you're trying to industrialize your economy, you're going to be having taxes high, you're going to have custom taxes high, you're going to have wages low. And this means you've just got a recipe for constantly high radicals no matter what you do. Anyway, after this revolution, it came about sort of the halcyon days. I fought a few wars with Austria to help Romania and so on, and things got rather interesting after that. Now, I don't know what's going on, but I don't know if the latest patch has broken anything, but every nation in this game, including myself, has had at least multiple revolutions. France has had 2 revolutions, eventually becoming a armed forces-led president. Either it was Yalman. Of course, the British have also had their own revolution, becoming a republic, and of course, Canada has become independent as a republic. The South Africans are also revolting, and of course, the East India Trading Company became its own presidential dictatorship. The Austrians, of course, once again are collapsing on themselves. Prussia was once again cucked by the eternal civil war between Bavaria and liberal Bavaria, and the Russians actually had their own civil war that led them to a constitutional monarchy, where slavery is banned, and I believe serfdom is actually over as well. Yes, and serfdom is also over. So there was a lot of civil wars in this game, and yeah, and you can probably tell that things got slowly a bit broken with communist Uru, fascist Uluru. I don't even know who Uluru is. It's a republic led by President Damu Wonga of the Aboriginal Company, and the Australian Uprising, Communist Australia, Revolutionary Australia, Revolutionary Australia, and Noongar, and a little bit of Maori. Yes, a little bit broken. And of course, whatever this is, you've got fascist America led by President Chester Ramsay. You've got the United States of America. You've got New Africa led by Chairman John Somerville. And then you've got New Africa, led by President Martin Dalton, and then the Confederate States of America, led by President Wyndham Bott. It's all a bit broken right now. I don't know if it's the patch or just a bad, but you can probably guess that something has gone wrong here. Something has gone badly wrong here. But yeah, I think the Ottoman Turks was a very interesting nation. That is really about trying to really save the sick man of Europe. Again, rather fortunately or unfortunately, I had a load of events trying to cure the sick man of Europe at the start of the game, but as soon as the revolution occurred, the event stopped, and so I guess I completely circumvented the event chain for the Ottomans. But it's a very unique nation because it has nothing going for it. Whereas other nations have their pros and cons, the Ottoman Empire has all cons, and it's just you trying to fix the problem. And the way you go about that can, of course, vary. You can either do what I do and do the slow sort of individual industrialization and becoming self-sustainable at the cost of a political system that is completely broken by radicals from every walk of life. You can, of course, give up becoming a recognized power and focus on a certain industry, which will give you more political stability at the cost of losing your independence. Or you can, of course, just ride the revolution and try and reform through the revolutions, which is probably the most viable tactic if you really want to mini-max at the cost of potentially becoming prey for the other national powers. But without further ado, let us then, of course, discuss our markets and actually go into more detail. So, Ottoman Empire. Bureaucracy is more or less fine. Authority is good. I've had to counsel on my authority so I could suppress certain political parties. I think a big mistake I made as the Ottoman Empire wasn't suppressing certain political parties. If I suppressed them, then of course, potentially this would never have happened and I may have been more lucky. Again, there was no issues with really... Income was always bad. I'll let this run for a little bit. But income, as the Ottoman Turks, was extremely bad throughout, because even though I've had to whack up taxation, and even though I've had to sort of depend on, because of my initially bad legal system and laws, there simply wasn't enough revenue to actually industrialize a lot of the time. So I was constantly riding the economic system to the hilt, and I mean the hilt. Like everyone was being taxed to poverty, and that was so I could force reforms. And every now and then I would have a bit of a what do you call it? A recession, which threatened to kill my economy. Actually, oddly enough, wars actually improved my market. I don't know why, but for some reason, going to war always meant that I always, for the first years of the war, actually made money. I don't know why that is, but actually, the initial stages of war was always made me happy, because it was for those few moments I actually saw green in my economic system, which was nice. And of course, we didn't have our GDP. Now, unfortunately, you won't be able to see the total GDP because it starts at 1910, where, of course, the revolution occurs. You can see one of the recessions, another recession, another recession. Really, the Ottoman Turkish market is always very prone to recession. I think it's because of the quality of life, also your dependency on taxation early on, and also the inability to really forcibly expand your markets for fear of other major powers coming in and clapping you. Of course, peaceful expansion of your markets is one way of doing it, but there's no guarantee other nations may attack. And a few times I've had to try and defend Sindh or defend Afghanistan from British colonialism, which of course has been somewhat successful, but also not successful, as you can probably see with Oman becoming a victim of the British Empire and so on and so forth. Literacy was a massive issue because, of course, I had to pass literacy reforms or education reforms, which was extremely difficult to do because of the political systems, meaning that often I'd upset a political stakeholder that would threaten revolution unless I didn't do what I was told. Or I'd be trying to pass the legislation reform, and what would happen is then I'd have a revolution because others wanted migrant control, and I'd have to cancel that policy to appease the other stakeholders. Eventually, I was able to get through public education, but most of the time I couldn't even afford it because my economy was so bad. And so I had to instead depend on very cheap very cheap systems. Now, a good cop-out I found was, of course, in most nations, if you're having high turmoil, just crack out the social security and crack out the law enforcement. Unfortunately, as the Ottoman Empire, you simply can't afford that many subsidies, and so often you've got a very unforgiving nation with low subsidies, low policing, low education, because you just don't have the markets or the income to sort of use that sort of radical decreasing method. But eventually, towards the end game, I was able to achieve that as well. Of course, radicals always going up, always going down. I always had high radicals as Ottoman Turks or Turkey now, because of the political system, and of course the multiculturalism, or the lack of multiculturalism, and of course slavery, meaning that I always had high radicalism, which meant that I was always at risk at some civil war at some stage. And then, but now you can see my law, a lot of this going up because I've now decided not to pass any more laws, and because my economy and my standard of living is beginning to go up. You can see where the standard of living was in 1910 during the Civil War. It's plummeted. I think it was at a stage where it was at like 10. So initially I was on like the 14, 15 bracket for Turkey throughout, or the Ottoman Turks throughout my playthrough, and eventually I was able to get it higher once I started to sort of stabilize my domestic industry. But as you can probably tell, the Civil War and the economic downturn sort of destroyed that, and then I was able to recover. And since then, again, very vulnerable the Ottoman markets to external market forces, and of course very vulnerable to reductions in quality of life. Again, it may not look like much, but a dip like this, one second, let me bring it up. But a dip like that could be the difference between revolution or secession or complete government collapse, and a dip like this again could be the difference between complete government collapse. So bear that in mind. Of course, the population eventually did come up, increase once I did introduce multiculturalism and actually abolish slavery and sort of a separation of state for religion, and that was gradually getting improving. You see here with my reforms. I think this is when I added secularization that things got better. And of course, the people who are currently at the top is myself with a GDP of 658 million, because again, I decided a long game of a self-sustainable domestic economy, which I don't think is the most optimum strategy as Turkey, because you end up with too many important political parties are all radical in one way or another. A pretty high standard of living towards the end, and a pretty high population. And then, of course, we had Austria followed closely behind, followed by France, and then the British have dumped because they've lost their markets, with the East India Company now sort of the next runner-up, followed by Italy, Prussia, Russia, and fascist America, which has almost been in an eternal war since like the 1800s. So if we see when the fascist America came to be, 1908, so it's been pretty much constantly revolting since 1908, and the United States of America has never actually won this battle. So it tells you a lot about this current military system. This entire world is fucked. Like I don't know what to tell you. Like this entire world is a complete mess. I don't know why, but it is. So there you go. So let's go more about the legal system. So of course, clout rises and falls since 1916, and so on and so forth. But the main problem is each government party, because of the nature of my economy, which was very wide, with rural industry and industrial industry, a university, some universities, some bureaucracy, quite a heavy bureaucracy. I've got a social economic system that has a lot of different stakeholders, from your farmers to your laborers to your intelligentsia. Now, normally you can get away with that. You can just, like, in most nations like the USA and so on and so forth, you can get away with that because they all have pretty similar views. Not as the Turks. The Turks all have completely opposing views, and they will kick off at a moment's notice. Even now with the Republic, these guys will kick off. Like if I try and reform, like this is probably the best I've had it in ages. Like they're all neutral. That's because I've simply stopped reforming my government. So if I try to bring the trade union and intelligentsia, that works pretty well. Try to bring the industrialists in, that doesn't work very well. That doesn't work very well. That doesn't work very well. And that doesn't work very well. Now, bear in mind that the reason this is working so well is because of my revolution. The fact that these new political parties are much less radical than what they were before the revolution. During the revolution, if you so much as try to put two parties together, the odds are they wouldn't gel. And then, of course, you had your laws. And so my main effort was initially to sort of liberalize and increase my education. Then once I focused my education, improve my taxation. And then once I've improved my taxation, move into multiculturalism and banish slavery. Unfortunately, because of the political system and how it works, that simply doesn't work. So you can see here, if you so much as attempt to pose one single change in a policy, will normally piss off about 3 stakeholders as Turkey. You might make one party happy, but everyone else will get massively upset. And now the petty bourgeoisie are just going to start radicalizing. You try and change another law. Let's try and restrict child labor. Okay, the industrialists won't kick off too much. You can just about get away with that one. But still, -6 is enough to get to radicalization territory. Try and go workers' protections. Good luck with that. You've pissed off 2 parties. I mean, you might get away with it now after the revolution. Protected speech, try and go to rights of assembly. God help you. You're going to have 3 political parties kick off. And of course, banishing slavery was one of the big ones. And of course, the health system. Again, you're always pissing one powerful stakeholder off. No home affairs. Good luck with that. The army is going to riot. The petty bourgeoisie are going to riot. Guaranteed liberties, good luck with that. The armed forces is going to stab you in the back. The petite bourgeoisie are going to stab you in the back. And of course, if you do professional army, let's go with national militia, guys. Oh God, the army is now going to kick off and I'm going to die. So bear in mind, this is now with the liberal government involved. Back when you're playing the Ottoman Turks, like you were getting -20, -10 for every single policy. And so you had to wait out until the stakeholders got small enough, like the state governors, before you could do your reforms. And even then, once the stakeholders got small enough, 2 other more radical parties came to the front. And when I mean radical, I don't mean liberal. I mean radical in that their policies are still conservative. And if you go against them, they will just destroy you. So the Ottoman Turks are a very difficult political landscape to navigate, especially because it's historical as well. It was a nation that was trying to fight traditionalism and liberalism and reform, and it's supposed to be difficult to form a liberal nation as the Ottoman Turks. And in fact, I suspect that actually it's a nation that shouldn't be liberalizing, and you should instead focus on a different style of play than what I did. Instead of going all round, I suspect you should specialize, and then you only have to deal with a handful of radical stakeholders. But regardless, so the first policy I picked was professional army because that didn't piss many people off. It just kept the army happy. Then, of course, I tried to move down to public schools. This initially upset the religious political figures, the devout, or they called it devout now, but I think they were just called something else at the time. But unfortunately, the quote-unquote liberal elite of the petite bourgeoisie and the intelligentsia revolted because they wanted migration controls. I eventually passed migration controls, but it was too late and the first revolt occurred. Again, these are the liberals. From there, I sort of had to softly navigate, and I thought, you know what, let's focus on taxation, because you can see here you start off a really bad tax system as the Ottomans if you're sticking to a conventional sort of industrialization. So you can see even like initially it's on land-based taxation with of course a -697,000 profit, and then of course you have proportional taxation that gives you about 1 million revenue, which of course is the sort of the taxation you want if you're becoming a more of a modern state. This took about 30 to 40 years before I could enact it. And I needed it because it was the money I needed to industrialize, and eventually I was able to pass that through. From there, it got to about 1905, and I was able to eventually ban slavery because the state governors became too small a group to kick off. But even then, they still threatened to kick off regardless, but luckily they didn't actually revolt. And at that stage, a combination of the communists and the intelligentsia effectively revolted for universal suffrage. And because they were too strong, and because I underestimated that revolt, that's when the Turks came to power. Now, when they did once they did revolt, I had that short week of older parties together being happy. And I noticed at that stage I was dealing with a lot of civil unrest and a lot of secession in the Balkans. And so I had to push through multiculturalism, which I was able to do during that short moment of peace, that short moment where everyone agreed with each other because they just revolted. And I was able to get that through before it all devolved into separate fragmentation and chaos once again. And I think towards the end, I was able to push through total separation because the religious groups hadn't become too dominant. But since then, I've become completely a victim to the political system. And every now and then, a small group of revolutionary comes demanding wealth voting, or they come demanding. You can see here, like landowners and the trade unions want this. And of course, if you try and pass it, then they'll be happy for a couple of weeks. They'll go away, and then the opposite group comes and starts demanding you cancel it, or they're going to revolt. And so now I'm just a hostage of the economic system, where I can no longer really change the state of my nation, leading to initially I had women's suffrage for a while as well, but all the liberal groups and all the political parties revolted unless I got propertied women. So I had to revert my reforms back because the political system and the political classes simply are holding me hostage right now. I cannot do any further changes to the education system. I can't do any further changes because I am now held hostage by these group of fucking crazies who will revolt and kill me effectively the second I try and do anything different. I am now a paralyzed state that's completely stagnant and unable to reform. But I'm lucky because I have done most of my reforms at this stage, and now I've just started cheesing it. So once they threaten revolt, I pretend to enact a law until they go away, then I cancel the law. So they're rushing into the presidential office, waving scimitars and threatening to shoot me unless I pass the laws. And I'm saying, okay, I'm writing it now, and then they leave the office, and then I rip up the piece of paper. That's what I'm doing right now. I need help. I'm being held hostage by my government. Please, someone send help. And I was able to get a couple of reforms through. So initially it was the police state to lower turmoil. Well, first it was colonial affairs for colonialisation for those extra resources. Then, of course, it became education, the police force, and then eventually subsidies and a little bit of home affairs. And altogether, I just about survived. Well, I didn't. I revolted and I lost one of my main objectives, was to keep the empire or keep the Ottomans. But still, it's interesting. So again, what I would have said is perhaps the most optimum strat for Turkey is either to revolt now or revolt as soon as possible to get more liberal people in power, or you should instead focus on a one-dimensional economy that really makes only a small group of political backers strong. So, for example, just focus on the rural aspects of your nation so you have a large rural base. And in fact, it's one of those nations where normally you expect us to reform willy-nilly. You just think, okay, I'm always going to liberalize because that's where all the benefits are. Actually, as the Ottoman Turks, a liberalization is perhaps not to your benefit a lot of the time. I mean, you have to because you need to keep the Balkans. You've got to liberalize as the Turks, but in doing so, you also run the risk of revolution and collapse. And so you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. But one way I could see potentially making Turkey or the Ottomans more stable is becoming a much more one-dimensional import economy where you focus on one resource such as clothing or furniture, or focus on on industry and then import your agricultural needs, or focus on your rural farmland and then import your industrial needs, which probably would be the more effective way of running it, because then of course you don't have these equal group of crazies that's more threatening you with immediate destruction if you decide to do anything that they don't like. So that's a very interesting way the political system worked out, because of course I went in with a certain system because it worked for every other nation, and this system didn't work for the Ottomans because of the nature and the extremeness of their political parties. And of course we went down to our budget. So you can see here I'm going through the halcyon days now. I'm pretty much top dog. My market's pretty strong because we've had the turbulence and I've been able to reform. And now I'm keeping the taxation now. Now if I brought it to max, you can see I'd be making 1.11 million. But then of course the radicals would increase and increase and increase, and then I'd have another revolutionary issue. This is probably the lowest I've had my radicals in decades. I've been very lucky, and of course, government wages are low and military wages are low because I needed to. I simply needed to. Our most profitable states are, of course, Ankara. I don't know why it's our most. Oh no, our most profitable states is, of course, Eastern Thrace and, of course, Aydin, because they've got a rather strong coal industry, which I needed, and they've got some silk. As you can see here, I've invested heavily into silk early game, so I could build fancy clothing to actually corner my market. And of course, Eastern Thrace, you've got iron, you've got some wood, and once more, a lot of silk. A big problem I had as the Ottomans is the lack of infrastructure, because no one is educated enough to run it or lack the qualifications. And so I probably would recommend you focus building toll in a few regions rather than what I do is build wide. Instead, build toll, and then you can basically localize your industry or localize your rail lines in a single place, and then for the other places you just put a spattering of farms and that. Don't do what I do and try to expand wide, because early to mid game you simply won't have anyone to run your trains, and it's not going to help turmoil. It's just not going to help. You're just going to roll over and cry. And of course, our assets, we now have a maximum credit limit of 124 million. This was always in the red. Very rarely do I have it in green. I was just trying to outpace the debt by increasing GDP, which sort of worked until you have recessions and then you cry because your economy is collapsing. And you can tell how desperate I got, because of course I had to resort to tactics such as downscaling my army to lower levels to save money, and of course completely deleting my navy because I simply could not afford to keep it. And so you can see here I have pretty much no naval force because I couldn't afford a navy. But hey ho. Buildings, of course, we can see here we have a little bit of a food industry, but not a lot. I get most of it focused early on textiles, furniture, and tools, because I tried my best to industrialize, but because none of the major powers really recognize you as a threat, they buy a lot of your imports. And so I was building so many tools that because half of those tools were always being traded out. I suppose I could have tried isolationism, but I daren't try and change the government, because in doing so I would face, again, civil war, revolution. So the less I touch the government tab, the better. And you can see small industries and paper simply because I couldn't afford it. Some industries and chemicals because I needed the explosives. Some on dye plants for the late game, but an awful lot in steel. Perhaps I think this was a product of the constant need for coal, iron, and wood, because everyone was buying my tools. And so in the end I kept on buying steel mills as well, because hey ho, I'm doing 3 things, I might as well do that as well. And so I always had a deficit of clothing, I always had a deficit of fancy goods and that, which I had to import at some stages of the game, or were imported to me. A big old motor industry. Again, I made a tragic mistake of building high on railways early on, which simply weren't doing anything or fixing the problem. I even built an awful lot of universities, but again, no one's qualified to run them, so there was no point in doing so. In any case, that just meant that I had a large locomotive industry and a steel industry for exports, so it wasn't the end of the world. But still, a lot of these industries early on, no one's really qualified to run. So a lot of my wasted expenditure early on was a lot of these industries that simply didn't have the infrastructure or didn't have anyone to actually run or maintain them. A tiny arms industry and a tiny munitions plant, simply because of my military model of, oh god, a war starting, panic, everyone re-equip and we'll import the weapons we need. Like, we were not a very strong military nation. And of course, tools are a big one. But we are beginning to see some reforms with the urban centre, some arts academies, and power plants. We are beginning to become a little bit more sort of urbanized towards the end of the game, now that we've become top dog. For rural, we've got, of course, a lot of wheat. Again, a lot of it's divided because sometimes I couldn't afford the fertilizer because I didn't have enough fertilizer factories. Again, you've got a bit of a blend between different methods and a blend between different sort of processing plants. Again, I couldn't get enough coal out of the ground to change all of these to a cheaper method. And so a lot of the time, like, there's a few ones I could do now, But again, I had to pick and choose my battles. And so a lot of my investment went into explosives for the coal industry, explosives for the iron industry, which again were massive industries, and into the lead industry for fertilizers and so on. We had a few luxury goods because of our colonial endeavors that allowed us to stay a bit more independent for longer. And we had a big old logging industry as well. Luckily, because we puppeted Egypt, they've got a big old grain supply, so that fed our nation for a large part of the game. And our development, we've got a few electric rails to hopefully improve the infrastructure. And again, we've got a substantial number of conscript centres and barracks, but our military method of panic and buy guns overseas was really the sort of our go-to option for survival. But yeah, our big industry early on was definitely silk. Silk is what saved us and actually got money in, because to build clothing factories, if we look at the actual input for clothing factories, they need fabric and silk for luxury clothing, and they need tools, fabric, and dye if you're going to use sewing machines. But if you're doing hand sewn stuff, you don't have to use, I don't think you have to use dye. And so early on, we could use the clothing industry to actually bring money in, because we had a load of silk, so we could build designer furniture. And that's what sort of got the ball rolling for us to economically develop. So I highly recommend you sort of find the silk and use that, because if you try and go straight into heavy industries, you're just going to have a bad time because your nation simply can't afford all that sort of mines and stuff like that. And then for our markets, okay, if we take a look, goods we need to import are now luxury clothes, funnily enough, probably because half our stuff is being bought. Tea, which again we could build some more up if we wanted to. And again, a lot of consumer goods, a lot of my stuff was industrial because I needed to industrialize. Once this has all been sorted, I was going to move into sort of the more consumer-based market. But simply put, this is one of the few nations that your supply will always be less than demand. You simply can't build up quick enough to meet all your nation's demands. Wow, it's a lot of stuff I'm importing. I think that was during my Civil War period, and so you always sort of be dependent on one in one way or another on foreign exports. So you can see our grain is a little bit in deficit, but nothing too bad. Our clothing is in a massive deficit. Again, it's pretty bad because again I focus too much on industry, and it's looking bad. I probably could import some, but like I said, if I wasted time building clothing factories, what would happen is that my steel industries, or well, my coal industry wouldn't be dealt with. See, right now my coal industry is in the black. That means all the industries that use coal will start losing money, which means everyone will start losing money, which means higher radicalism. So I'm always putting out fires as the Ottoman Turk. I can't just go, let me just spend the next 10 days investing in clothes, because in those 10 days the rest of the market collapsed because there's a coal shortage, and now the radicals are knocking down my door trying to chop my head off. And so yeah, you're always putting out fires. This again looks like I overproduced tools. Don't be fooled by the orange bar of doom. In fact, what will happen in like a day's time if I keep the game running is that someone's going to buy 10k or half my tools, and none of my factors will have tools to actually do their job. So these are a bit misleading. I'd rather you focus on the price on the right than actual supply on the left, or the balance on the left, because within 2 days, another two countries could just take my entire stock. It's an issue that some people have brought up in the game, well, in forums, but I don't think it's the end of the world. I think it's actually pretty good because it means that you can wage economic warfare. You can make a nation dependent on you for your product while delaying their industrialization. Then, of course, once they build more, you can cancel your exports and watch their economy collapse. So I don't think it's as bad as people say, and there are always options to avoid foreign imports, vis-a-vis embargoes and, of course, isolationism. But as throughout most of the game, I'm trying to keep relations high with Russia and Austria. I had to sort of not rock the boat, so to speak, because I am more or less a paper tiger. But see, a lot of our domestic goods industry is pretty lacking. So electricity is always going to be lacking. That's why we're always building more electrical plants. Wood wasn't too bad, but we were growing furniture for somehow is really high for some reason. I suspect they've stopped buying for some reason. And again, we've got a lot of deficits. There's always deficits in the Ottoman Empire. You're never going to have a self-sustaining economy completely. You're always going to be putting out fires, which you need to sort of rely on imports or custom markets to save. So during my halcyon days of a large custom market, that was okay for me. It wasn't the end of the world, but when I was still a small nation, it was a non-custom market nation. I was on the struggle bus. The one thing we did have ample of initially was our ample luxury resources. You can see that's changed now. I suspect because of buy orders, perhaps. No. Let's press the button. It may be because of it's the whole market and not just my nation. That's potentially why. Yeah, it's probably potentially why. I see. Looks like we still have some slavery in some of our custom market nation, which is odd. But I'm always in deficit somewhere. Like I am more or less a paper tiger. Like I'm not like Great Britain or the USA where I've got copious amounts of everything. In this nation, I'm still very much lacking the basic goods to keep population happy. It's not the end of the world because of course I could trade for a lot of these goods. So I can trade for grain. I can trade for clothes if anyone built any clothes, and so on and so forth. But you can't become completely independent as Turkey. Yeah, even it's a little late game because you just simply don't have the POPs, the qualifications, the infrastructure, and so on to do so. But of course, our big exports were tools, because everyone bought them, explosives, iron, steel. So we were making a lot of money during the tool shortage phase of our life. Of course, other markets have got more or less the same sort of thing. Yeah, they're very low on that. They got a lot of tools now. I think Russia kept on buying my tools, the bastards. Yeah, I think the Russians like always were buying a ton of my tools. Not so much anymore, but the Russians and the Austrians, boy, they're greedy boys. Like I couldn't, they, and because you're not a recognized major, they don't see you as a threat, so they're more than happy to buy your shit. And it did break me a little bit. So this wasn't a product of me trying to corner the tool market. This was a product of trying to make the other nations leave me alone because they kept on using up all the tools. And then, of course, we have our military. Again, not much to show. We've got no navy. We had to delete our navy. And, of course, we have got 293 somewhat garbage troops because if we look down on our technology tree, we are nowhere near down to the bottom of the technology tree. We're still coming out of World War One as Turkey. We haven't even gone to concrete fortifications yet. We don't even have planes, so we're still very behind. So we are a paper tiger. I mean, we can produce a lot of troops if we have to, but our nation will probably implode from a revolution, or probably our troops will probably just get mown down because then there's nowhere near up to the standard. Of course, our diplomacy, we decided to make Egypt a puppet, and then we did soft diplomacy, which has its pros and cons. I mean, soft diplomacy is good because it means there's less war, which Turkey can't really afford to do, or the Ottomans can't really afford to do, but also means that if you have any slight issues or you get infamy too high, everyone leaves your customs union, which is a pain, an absolute pain in the ass. And so often I try to do my rapid aggressive expansion early to make sure no one left the customs union. Now, Afghanistan's been a fickle mistress throughout most of the game. I've been trying to buy its opium or trying to make it join my customs union for quite some time. It goes through fits and starts of joining and leaving, but hey ho, it is what it is. Of course, if we go back to our politics tab, we'll talk a bit more about the different parties. So you have the Communist Party, which was, of course, a byproduct of the industrialists. Of course, they oppose slavery, but they're neutral to slavery being banned. So they will kick off about slavery existing, but they won't do anything to actually ban slavery. So good luck trying to ban slavery. Of course, they're all for the anarchy and they're all lunatics and so on and so forth. And the intelligentsia are pretty crazy as well. But again, they're neutral to slavery being banned. So they'll always start kicking off. And of course, they're my big power brokers. My own fault, really. I built far too many universities, which in turn led to the literati getting too strong. And I should have probably instead done more to become a more streamlined economy and just focused on one aspect. So I'd have one very strong national demographic. But you can't really do that as Turkey because you need, if you unless you want to become dependent on other nations and become a secondary power, which I didn't want to do. I wanted to become a self-sustaining Turkey, which I could just about barely achieve. I mean, I'm still very import dependent, but it is what it is. And of course, we've got our armed forces that is pretty happy with most things, unless you dare change the army, dare change any of the army laws or the sort of police laws, in which case it will just revolt and kill you. The petite bourgeoisie are pretty much the same. Yeah, and of course, again, they've got a few regressive policies, but they're all fairly strong. 6%, 6.1, 9.5, 11%, 23%, 42%. They're all fairly strong political parties, and what will often happen is two will come together to revolt over a certain policy. So bear that in mind. Of course, they want to join the Freedom and Accord Party now. As soon as you pass a law, they'll just kick off later. So bear that in mind as well. Of course, our cultures, we could not form any nations, and you were able to get multiculturalism through, which saved us from our constant rebellions in the Balkans and allowed us to keep the Balkans and total separation. But this was done more as a reaction to the constant secessions, because I knew if it kept going, the Austrians would probably join in eventually. And again, as a product of the rising secessionist movement. And if you take a look at our pops, our largest pops are Turkish, then Greek, then Mashriki, then Bulgarian, Albanian, Kurdish, and so on. Again, standard of living is pretty high now because it's a late game, but poor infrastructure does lead to, really you can't build wide as Turkey. I built wide, I suffered from it. Don't do it. Just build tall in certain states because you simply can't afford to build wide early on. Take a look at your population. You can see we still have a very heavy population in Thrace, Hogden, Giga, and Aden, and these lovely lasses. So we've got our lower strata that's still paying an awful lot for goods. The best I could do is the Ottomans. Yeah, and of course they're spending not so much on services, but buying a lot on grain and clothes. The middle strata, again, still paying a significantly high amount of money. And of course, we've got the affluent who are really, this is not impressive. This is pretty standard throughout the game. They're plus 10% base price. Yeah, it's not really much to look at. And of course, our demographics are split down from labourers, mechanists, clerks, engineers, shopkeepers, farmers, and this is the thing that killed me. The thing is, I've got too much of a wide demographic. I don't think a wide demographic is a good idea as the Ottomans. A smaller demographic or repressed demographics will probably be more likely to save you. Of course, all the methods to reduce the damage, such as welfare payments and police force, you simply can't afford. So yeah, it's one of those things that you really do struggle with as the Ottomans. That wide demographics normally result in radical politics. From there, if we take a look at our population in terms of Turkey, we've got Turkish, Greek, Mishraki, Albanian, Kurdish, Persian, Serbian, English, about 700k, Bedouin, South Italian, Dixie, 318k. Okay, 318k living Dixie, Tedder, North Caucasian, and Lancastrian Bantu. And of course, religion is broken down into Sunni, Shia, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, and Animist. That's probably down in over here. So if we take a look at, of course, Constantinople or Istanbul, population of 4.9 million with Turkish, Greek, Persian. It's still fairly homogenous, bearing in mind multiculturalism came late. Most people fairly happy. Well, actually, they're all losing money horribly early on. Why are they losing money? So you can see I had to stop playing because it was getting too slow. That's not good. That's not good. But no, 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 no. I don't know why, because my taxation's so low as well. I suspect it's because of the base value of consumable goods, which I would probably have to fix. But yeah, that's not. No, no, no. The clerks are gonna kill me. Oh, they're part of the intelligence as well. No, no, no. Leave me alone. Please don't do it. Yeah, that's not good. Okay, buildings. Yeah, very strong trade center, a strong motor industry. Again, I fell for the build wide strat. Not a good idea. Again, if you try and do a wide economy, you'd sort of have to build wide anyway because your resources are spread out. So I shouldn't have built wide, but what's done is done. I should have built tall and just focused on one key aspect of the industrial sector. It sort of organically happened towards the end, but you can see I've got industries that aren't fully being employed, and I'd have a workable population that is pretty non-existent. Yes, it's a pretty shaky economic system, very shaky. And of course, if we go over to say, I don't know, Bosnia, we've got capitalists for some reason, and I can't complain. Engineers, mechanists, buildings. The product of the build wide strategy, the idea is that if everyone had a job, they wouldn't revolt. It didn't really work out. Again, 11 railways. I mean, now it's fully employed, but it was a waste of money early on. I shouldn't have done that. And then, of course, we have our cultures, which are Turkish, English for some strange reason, Bosniak, Serbian, Croatian, Persian, Filipino, Greek, and Greek. And let's check the Sinai finally to see what's the Sinai's like. Buildings, just one university, and that was my desperate attempt to educate enough people to run the railway. Shouldn't have done that because I needed more people for the mines, I think. And then, of course, we have a load of capitalists. These guys are happy as Larry. And their population is, of course, Turkish, Persian, Filipino, Greek, Mizrahi, Afro-Antillean, Spanish, Bulgarian, Bedouin. There's a lot of different pops, an awful lot of different pops. Somali, Greek, Mizrahi, Spanish, Bulgarian, Bedouin, Dixie. Oh, so this is where the Dixies are. Well, there's 6K of them, so Anglo-Canadian, Australian. Yeah, it's a very hodgepodge nation. And then, of course, we have got, let's take a look at Basra. Mishriqi, Bedouin, Belarusian, Yemeni, Turkish. And these guys aren't doing too bad. Oh, there's a lot of plus 20 infrastructure. I probably should pay more attention to those little bits of information. Yeah, probably should have done that. Oh well, it's done is done. And for our journal, we pretty much ignored half of these because we couldn't afford to do any of them. I'm still pretty much in the Dark Ages, and I wasn't going to waste any points or money on any of this. I probably could do it now because it's 1926, but I didn't want to do it until then. In short, let's take a look at some of the other nations. So let's look at Spain. That Queen's always hanging around. She's never died. She'll never die. Yeah, you can tell. I think the latest patch may have broken something, or maybe it's just a bad game, but the economy's always been a bit turbulent for the nations now. I hate this flag. Get rid of this flag. The British Republic flag is awful. Prussia has always eternally been cuckolded by Bavaria. Imagine if you could just get away being annexed by pretending to have a civil war. Yep. And of course, Prussia had its own revolution. It's now led by a republic under Stefan Leonhardt. Look like a recession period for these guys. Another revolution. Yeah, that's probably another. Something is broken in this game. Something is broken. Let's look. Something is broken right now. I don't know why, but for some strange reason, after a certain stage, even with reforms, their nations just collapsed. I felt this game, something was broken. I felt like the AI wasn't building as much as it should. And yeah. Can you tell where the Civil War was? Can you guess where the Civil War was? New Africa. Let's take a look at this bad boy. Communist Africa. Oh, its economy's not doing too bad. Weird pop break. I don't know why there's two new Africas. It seems a tad strained. I'm just trying to see if New Africa's got slavery enabled. No. Okay. No memes to be had there. And then, of course, the Confederate States of America. Again, one like I don't know what is broken. I don't know what is broken right now, but something is broken right now. I think the patch has broken something. And of course, Australia. Let's take a look at the Aboriginal. This initially was all of Australia, apart from a little bit of territory here, but it looks like they also fell for the Civil War meme and have collapsed in themselves to boot. Let's take a look at their politics. Okay, slavery banned. No ways. Yeah, the world of Ottoman Turks. Like, even though it looks bad for us, it looks real bad for everyone else. Like, it's pretty bad. Like, economic collapse, economic collapse, economic collapse, economic collapse, economic collapse. At least the Chinese weren't doing too badly. Yeah, the Chinese did pretty well. Then the Russians. Yeah, it's all a bit strange. But I really had a lot of fun playing as the Ottomans because you have a lot of problems and there's many different ways to fix it. Do you either resign yourself to becoming a secondary power and just build up a specialist industry to sort of survive? Do you try and immediately revolt and reform liberally? Do you try and preserve the monarchy and maintain the country while reforming? And everything you do has something fighting, something stopping you. Every sort of whether it's the other stronger powers that are willing to crush you, whether or not it's your economy that just can't do anything, or political parties trying to fight you, you really do get a glimpse at sort of the historical Ottoman Turks in terms of their sort of dilemma about reform and conservatism, about trying to become a modern state, but while at the same time having political parties fight against that modernization. Really, this sort of civil war mechanic here about slavery should probably be copy and pasted and brought over to the USA, because like it was a big issue for me to try and reform and liberalize, as you can probably tell by the inconsequence of my liberalization process. I think it's a nation that is more pushed towards revolution as a necessity rather than reform. And I think it's also a nation that promotes multiple styles of play, whether or not you just give up the Balkans and focus on a culturally homogenous society, whether or not you focus on one demographic and build an economy based on that one demographic, or whether or not you try and industrialize and reform at the cost of constant pressure. It's a very fun nation to play, and it's really quite challenging to preserve. With a lot of the time, you were relying on luck, and feeling that one bad move could see the complete collapse of your nation. You really do feel like you're the sick man of Europe right now. Well, you do until you look at what's going on in the rest of Europe and you just laugh. But that's late game. Mid to early game, you really are just fighting to survive economically and trying to reform to survive, but in doing so, further pushing pressure for collapse. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Too long didn't read. Once I had stabilized, I took Greece, fought a few wars with Austria, through Romania. Tried to go to war to liberate the Arabian Peninsula and almost got clapped by the British, and of course established and had revolution It's I got lucky. I'll be honest with you. A lot of the time it was spent really just oh wow, 666.6, that's cursed. Sorry. The cursed number, oh god. Yeah, but yeah, a lot of the time I was just really exploiting the bad AI thinking in terms of warfare, and I probably shouldn't have survived a lot of the time. Like I shouldn't have survived the first war of Egypt. I shouldn't have survived the war of Russia. I shouldn't have survived the first revolution. But each time it was just me beating the broken AI who just left entire fronts abandoned. But I can see this you really being a victim in multiplayer games for the Ottomans, because all it takes is one nation just to gang up on you. Like you're gonna need external help, whether it's from the British or the French, in order to preserve some semblance of your empire, because you are so vulnerable to other nations that's willing to gobble you up. Like the Russians could come down, the Austrians could come down and just eat you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so I think the Ottomans will be the ultimate challenge nation to play. And I feel a lot of people are going to rage quit when playing Ottomans, because they're going to think it's going to play a certain way, and they're just going to realize that they're the punching bag of Europe, while potentially just being kept on life support, or on the other hand, just being divided amongst the spoilers. And of course, in multiplayer games, it's probably more a case of people eating you rather than trying to keep you on life support. But by the end of the game, we had become the world's greatest power, probably as a last nation standing rather than actual ability or talent. Also, construction points are on the lowest, so if we whacked them up to the highest, we have 2,188. But I'm on the lowest right now because I don't want to build anymore because the save's broken. Oh, well, the load is collapsing. The game is collapsing late game. I don't know why it's collapsing. It may be because of all these states and permanent civil wars. So what you see, I wonder if I can show it to you. You can sometimes see it if you click on a certain battle. Let's go over here. You can see like 20 battle reports stacking up on the right hand side. So while these nations are going through constant civil war, they're just loading and loading battles that aren't occurring, or attacks that never occur, meaning that the game is probably breaking because of the numerous civil wars that aren't being resolved. So Paradox, please do something about the civil war mechanic. Prussia wants to film Germany, let it do so. I don't want to go to 1926 and watch a slideshow, please, I beg you. But it's a very interesting nation that shows a really strong dynamic about political radicalization, and actually probably indicates that maybe reforms aren't always the way to go for a certain nation. And sometimes it's perhaps better to form your own sort of political system, and not going through the same cookie cutter way of a way of reform that other nations do. It's also a nation of very interesting sort of challenges, and a nation that really focus on culture and politics in order to survive, whereas other nations such as USA focus on expansion, or colonialism, or the British focus on industrialization and market expansion, or the Russians deal with reform. You are a nation that deals with reform of everything: reform of industry, reform of government, reform of culture, reform of infrastructure, reform of the army. You are a nation that needs to be saved effectively. Yeah, and the nature of the playthrough for the Ottomans is how well you survive. And in the end, I'd like to say I did a pretty good job of surviving. Of course, I could have done a few gamey things like attack Siam and stuff like that, but come on now, boys. Like, this is not, this is not a how to abuse the system and win. This is just sort of an after-action report of what I thought about each nation. And for the Ottomans, it is really a fun, challenging nation that will have you on the edge of your seat for most of the playthrough, where a single bad action, a single bad diplomatic play can spell disaster for your nation, and you're really riding it to the hilt, riding your taxation and your people's quality of life to the hilt, riding your supply and industry to the hilt, riding your army to the hilt, just really trying to push your nation to breaking point, in order to actually speed up and catch up with the rest of Europe. But that's it, gentlemen. It's a bit how do I call it, spatterbrained about how I approach playing as Turkey, but in simple places, in simple terms, tried to reform, almost died, reformed a little bit, died, carried on, now held hostage, began easy expansion against weaker states, formed a customs market, and then became a feeble attempt at liberating the Arab Peninsula, which failed dismally, and built wide, probably shouldn't have done so, and I'm now held hostage by my government that will always hate me no matter what I do. And bearing in mind, it is the liberal government and not the conservative government of the previous Ottoman Empire that, well, that was much worse. That was much worse. A bigger nightmare to deal with. Things I would point out is that you've got different options, different pros and cons to how you play it. If you try and become a first world industrial power, you will have to deal with reform and revolution. If you try and build for a stable society, you probably have to deal with secession and deal with being a secondary power. And if you do try and focus on expansion as well, you're going to face a lot of struggle financially. It's every option you have at your disposal is a catch-22, where something will normally bite you in the ass regardless of what you do. And it's about how you balance the ship. I almost balanced the ship and then failed at the last hurdle in 1910. But hey ho, I was still able to preserve the empire of the Ottomans one way or another. Also, I'll be playing with the next, I think, Annabed AI mod next time, because I think right now the AI is broken. I don't know what's going on, but this should not be happening in Europe. This shouldn't be happening. I don't know why, but it's happening. And for the love of God, please, Paradox, do something about this. Like, I don't know what you've done, but undo it now. I don't want to see this anymore. I don't want to see it. Stop. But that's it. Next nation to play, I think, will be the. I think it will be. I think it'll be Austria. I think the next nation will be Austria, because of course you haven't got a lot of places to expand, and you've got to deal with putting Prussia in its place. Maybe I'll try and form Germany as Prussia. I haven't decided yet. But thank you all for watching, and I will see you all later. Adieu.